The 1972 Summit Series, also known as the Super Series or the Series of the Century, is regarded by many as the greatest moment in Canadian sports history. It is what reclaimed Canada's pride as the top ice hockey powerhouse. But how did it all play out? Let's take a look. From the first ever international tournament in 1920 all the way to the mid-50s, Canada absolutely dominated international hockey. They won 15 of the 20 Olympic and/or World Championships during that time, and never placed lower than second. The way international teams worked was a bit different back then compared to what it is today though. Instead of assembling a team from all different leagues around the country, they would simply pick a team to represent the country. This was working wonders for Canada. That was until 1954 when the Soviet Union adopted the Canadian way of hockey and entered the World Championships for the first time. Canada didn't think much of them, expecting to capture yet another win. After the Canadian representative beat teams from Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, West Germany, Finland, and Czechoslovakia, they were looking to etch their names into the history books by winning yet another World Championship. But that all came to an end when they got demolished 7-2 in the finals by the Soviets. The Soviets would go on to win 9 straight Olympic and World Championship golds, and Canada looked like they might not be the top hockey nation anymore. There was still hope for the Canadians though. Back then, professional athletes were not allowed in international competitions, only amateurs. That means that NHL players, who are by far Canada's best hockey players, were not allowed to compete for their country against the Soviets. But on the other side, most of the Soviet players were taken straight from the Soviet army and were still considered amateurs. This meant that the Soviets were able to play their best players they had, while Canada was stuck with only their best amateur players. Over the next few years, Canada would work towards getting professional players in international competition, without much success at first. Canadian hockey fans were sure that if they're able to play their best NHL players against the Soviets, it would be an easy win for them, while the Soviets were also up to the challenge of playing the best in the world. So in 1969, negotiations started for a series between Canada and the Soviet Union, where Canada would be able to play their pro players. The negotiations ended with an agreement for an 8-game series, which would be known as the Summit Series. The first 4 games would be played in Canada and the last 4 in Moscow. If the series was tied at 4-4 after 8 games, the tiebreaker would be goal differential. On July 12, 1972, Canada would announce the roster for Team Canada, which included many future Hall of Famers such as Stan Mikita, Marcel Dionne, both Mahovlich brothers, and of course, although not in the Hall of Fame, Paul Henderson, with Ken Dryden taking the starting position between the pipes. However, they were not able to play all of their best players. Only players under NHL contracts were allowed to play for insurance reasons. This meant that many great players, most notably Bobby Hull, were not eligible to play since they were signed in the WHA. Bobby Orr was also sidelined for the tournament because of a terrible knee problem, which would end up being the reason he retired from hockey just a few years later. The assembly of the Soviet team was a whole lot more simple than Canada. They just brought back the same team as usual, which has been dominating the sport for years. Notable players included Alexander Ragulin, who played in 3 Olympics and 9 World Championships, Alexander Yakushev, who won 7 World Championships, and of course the legendary goaltender Vladislav Tretiak. The team was filled with mostly experienced and veteran players, with just a few making their international debut for the Soviets. They had pretty intense training leading up to the series, having a 2 workout a day training schedule, and even taking boxing lessons in preparation for the series. Leading up to the series, many Canadian hockey fans believed that this series would be a walk in the park for the Canadians, since they were finally able to use their best players. That belief was only strengthened early into the first game, as Canada found themselves up 2-0 thanks to goals by Phil Esposito, who scored just 30 seconds in, and Paul Henderson. However, the Soviets knew what they were doing. They were better trained in preparation for the series and had much better conditioning. They tired the Canadians out with short passes and moving the puck. The Soviets got the lead late into the second, and by the third and final period, they had complete control over the game. The final result was a 7-3 blowout victory for the Soviets. Canadians all around the country were left speechless and thought maybe they weren't as good as they originally thought. After the first game, it was clear that Canada needed to switch things up, which is exactly what they did. Head coach Harry Sinden switched 17 players around to give the team a better defensive lineup while also adding some toughness to the team. The Canadian strategy changed completely from the first game. Instead of going out and trying to pile on the goals in the first and just tire themselves out, They focused on wearing down the Soviets in the first with heavy and consistent hits. Esposito would score the first goal of the game again, this time in the second period, giving the Canadians the lead. The Canadians would go on to score 3 more goals in the game, including a shorty by Pete Mahovlich, to capture the 4-1 win and tie the series up at 1 game apiece. Game 3 started off great for the Canadians, having a 4-2 lead in the second period. But you know what they say about the 2-goal lead in hockey? The Canadians got too comfortable with the lead and the Soviets climbed back to tie the game at 4-4 by the end of the second. The third period was scoreless and there was no overtime in the series, which means that Game 3 ended in a tie, which kept the series tied after 3. For Game 4, Team Canada made 8 changes to the lineup, which is supposed to allow for more goals for. This, however, backfired and had the opposite effect. The result was a disorganized and undisciplined Team Canada. Bill Goldsworthy and Boris Mikhailov started the game with 2 quick penalties, which gave the Soviets an early 2-0 lead. Canada would try to fight back, including a last-minute goal by Dennis Hall, but it just wasn't enough. Canada got booed throughout the game in the series' final game in Canada, and after the game, Phil Esposito, who had taken a big leadership role on the team, gave this emotional interview.
Across Canada, we tried, we did our best, and for the people that boo us, geez, all of us guys are really disheartened and we're disillusioned and we're disappointed in some of the people. We cannot believe the bad press we've got, the booing we've gotten in our own buildings, and if the Russians boo their players, if the Russians boo their players like some of the Canadian fans, I'm not saying all of them, some of them booed us, then I'll come back and I'll apologize to each one of the Canadians, but I don't think they will. I'm really disappointed. I am completely disappointed. I cannot believe it. Some of our guys are really down in the dumps. We know we're trying. What the hell? I mean, we're doing the best we can, and they got a good team. And let's face facts. But it doesn't mean that we're not giving it our 150% because we certainly are.
He promised things would get better, but most Canadians doubted that, as even the head coach Harry Sinden admitted the game was a beating. Both teams would then travel to Moscow for the final 4 games of the series. Canada had 2 exhibitions against the Swedish national team to make sure that they got used to the wider rinks that European teams use. Before the games in Moscow, there were a few small tweaks to the roster, with a couple of players leaving back to Canada. The first game in Moscow started off great for the Canadian team, with a line of Bobby Clarke, Paul Henderson, and Ron Ellis producing early. Clarke would capture a goal and a pair of assists, while despite being knocked unconscious earlier in the game, Henderson showed that the Canadian team meant business by scoring a pair of goals. The Canadian team had a 4-1 lead in the third, and it looked like they were going to leave the ice with a tied series. However, the Soviet team struck 4 times in the third period to win the game 5-4. Canada was now on the brink of losing the series. They had their backs against the wall, and just one more loss would mean that they would lose the entire series. The odds were stacked against them as they needed to win 3 straight games to close out the series with a win. Game 6 of the series started with the Soviets striking first with a goal from Yuri Lyapkin early in the second. The Canadians did not take this lightly though, as they fought back with 3 goals in just a minute and a half to give Canada a 3-1 lead. The Soviets managed to score 1 more goal and had a goal called off, but it wasn't enough, as the Canadians walked away from Game 6 with a 3-2 lead and, more importantly, a chance to still win the series. Game 7 was a nail-biter. The first period ended in a 2-2 tie between the 2 powerhouses. We wouldn't see another goal until the third period, when Rod Gilbert gave Canada a 3-2 lead. It didn't last long though, as Alex Akushev would put the puck past Ken Dryden to tie up the game for the Soviets. Canada couldn't leave this game with a tie. They needed to win the game to extend the series. Luckily for them, with just a few minutes left, Paul Henderson scored a beautiful goal to score a very clutch one for Canada, which started to become a little bit of a theme. Canada would win the game 4-3, and we would go to a winner-takes-all Game 8. Heading into the 8th and final game, tensions were higher than ever before. The winner of this game would be crowned the winner of the series and unofficially named the greatest ice hockey powerhouse in the world. There was a big problem for Canada though, and that was the biased European referees who often favored the Soviets throughout the Moscow portion of the series. This led to a number of questionable calls in Game 8, which led to crucial power plays for the Soviets. Canada would take 2 penalties in the first 3 minutes of the game, which the Soviets were easily able to capitalize on to take the early 1-0 lead. They would then bury the puck on another power play to score their second of the game. The Canadians weren't letting up though, as the first period ended in a 2-2 tie. Canada cleaned up their act with the penalties in the second, only being penalized once. However, that didn't stop the Soviets from scoring goals. They found the back of the net 3 times compared to the Canadians 1 time, which gave them a commanding 5-3 lead heading into the third and final period of the series. The Canadians couldn't settle for a tie in this game, as the tiebreaker was goal differential with the Soviets led in. They needed to win this game to win the series, but they had their backs against the wall and it wasn't looking good for them. Canada would not accept defeat. Early in the third, a very determined Phil Esposito shortened the deficit to 1 with a quick goal. He would then continue to battle for his country as he earned himself an assist on Yvon Fournier's game-tying goal. The game was now tied, but the Canadians still needed a goal. With time ticking down on the clock, it looked like the Soviets, despite being tied in the game, would defeat the Canadians and win the series. With time quickly disappearing from the scoreboard, a man who had scored clutch goals for the Canadians all series long, Paul Henderson, jumped on the ice. And with only 34 seconds left in the game, this happened.
Has it on that wing. Here's a shot. Henderson made a wild stab for it and fell. Here's another shot. Right by the score. Henderson has scored for Canada. Henderson right in front of the net. And the fans of the team are going wild. Henderson right in front of the goal. With 34 seconds left in the game. An absolute mob scene over Paul Henderson as there should be. But you can't underrate the effort again of Phil Esposito. He gets the puck, he fights for it, he gets it back in front of the net, but it's Paul Henderson who's parked there, he bangs at it, and he beats Tretiak 3-0.
What you just watched is the biggest and most important goal in ice hockey history. A crazy come-from-behind series and game win for the Canadians finished with a last-minute goal from Paul Henderson. The entire country of Canada basically went on hold for this 8th and final game. School lessons were put on hold to watch the game. Millions upon millions of Canadians all across the country stopped whatever they were doing to watch this game. This series had a massive and lasting impact on Canadian culture and hockey culture as we know it today. There are many documentaries made on this series, songs made about the series, most notably Fireworks by the Tragically Hip, and many more. This series had a huge impact on the NHL as well, as many European players then came to North America to play in the NHL. Paul Henderson will forever be a Canadian hockey hero as he scored the goal heard around the world.